All right, enough money talk. Let's talk football and the month-long scouting exercise that is training camp, where those on the inside try to figure out what they have to work with, what their depth chart should look like, who their main guys are going to be this year, what they can do, and those of us on the outside try to make sense of these small glimpses that we get of highlight plays and rep distributions that are tweeted out by beat reporters. Anyone who's done this for a while knows the okie doke that is the training camp highlight video. We see short clips of guys making plays and come to all sorts of wrong conclusions about what that means, drafting players in fantasy that end up hardly seeing the field. So we thought that it might be beneficial to have a conversation with some of our colleagues from Sumer here that have been on the other side of things and might be able to help us filter what is important from what is not important. So we welcome to the show now Mike Maccagnan, longtime NFL executive, former Jets GM, joins us now. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
We also have a coach, Chuck Bresnahan, longtime defensive coordinator who can offer a slightly different perspective of training camp experience. Do you miss training camp at all, Chuck?
Oh, you always miss it this time of year. The blood just starts going.
I didn't know if that was the case or if it was like, no, this is actually the part I don't miss, right? Like all of the extra practices in the 100-degree heat, depending, I guess, on where you are. But yeah, I get that because this is the like first feel for what you have and all of the excitement of what can be, right?
Yes, you just do it for so long that you get to this time of year, you're itching to get back out there, and the camaraderie of being within a team. There's nothing, that is a substitute for that. So you do miss that, and it's fun. It's time for football, and everybody's getting excited, including myself.
So I don't know how much either of you guys are on social media, if at all. My guess is probably not at all. But in the last few years especially, we've started seeing a few things happen during training camp specifically, and that is highlight videos get passed around and people jump to conclusions about talent level based on one play sometimes. Rep distributions are tweeted out. Who's with the ones, who's with the twos, how many carries one guy gets versus another guy. And then finally, stats are tweeted out. That is a totally separate. Well, I mean, I guess that's a conversation we should have. I can tell you, for instance, that Shedeur Sanders went 9 for 9 on Monday in his first practice in pads with 2 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. And I see Mike laughing already because how ridiculous is this that we're tracking stats in practice, right? But I guess you could understand why somebody would want to do that because they think it might tell a story. Do you think it does at all, Mike? Are stats from a practice during training camp, let's start there, is that anything that we should actually put any weight behind? Like somebody's playing well versus not because of whatever the numbers were from that practice?
Yeah, I would say stats in practice when the reporters report those, again, it doesn't carry a lot of weight because you don't know what context it's in. If they're saying, no, it's in 7-on-7, it could be the ones versus the twos or the ones versus the threes. So sometimes that's not always indicative. What you did touch on, and this is something we used to do, and I'm pretty sure other teams do this also, is we would track the media. And, assuming, okay, the media are professionals, they're and the way that it's changed in the old days when I first started, it was one paper came out every morning. So the writers would write an article, it'd show up in the morning. Now there's constant stream of information out. And what you find is when you talk about the players, where they are on the depth chart, or if there's an injury, or if a guy leaves practice with an injury, and having, again, been in front offices for many years and been a general manager and seen the media pool and how they work, they're all very talented professionals. But some of that stuff actually is a tell when you're going through trying to identify where people are. Chuck can speak to this too. I know having been a coach, but the general philosophy is when players that you like do well, you want to put them in situations that not only get reps with starters or the better players, but you also want to put them in an environment where their growth will speed up quicker and be ready to play on Sunday in the fall.
Well, we always talked about it from a coaching standpoint that, within the team, that doesn't mean as much as it does to people looking from outside the building, because like Mike was saying, you may be doing something to progress somebody's progress to improve at a quicker pace by putting them with the ones, even though they may not have earned that right yet. So you'll mix and match. The other thing is each team has its own character. Each team has its own setup. And whether you're an experienced team with a coaching staff that's been intact, or you're a new team with a new set of players that's just starting to build a program, it's a completely different look that way. So you have to have contingency plans. You have to think as a coach, hey, if so-and-so goes down at the nickel position, how are we readjusting our secondary to fill that spot? So you may be doing it for very internal reasons that have nothing to do with the overall depth chart and who's the starter. It's more contingency plans. And that starts in the OTAs, the organized team activities during the off season, and then goes right into training camp. Now, if I had become a first-time coordinator with a new staff, with John Gruden in 1998 out in Oakland, Willie Shaw was our coordinator then. I was the secondary coach. It was, you were starting from scratch. So you had to get to know these players. It's a different reason, but we would mix and match players on the depth chart, even to the third week of training camp, just trying to get that right mix, that right fit. And you knew when it was right because they meshed together, and we kind of just kept working all different scenarios to get ready for that opening game.
So digging a little bit more into those decision progress, like I heard both of you say that we make that decision to progress a guy that we like. And so are those evaluations happening on a daily basis? Should fans, when they are reading the media and see a change from Monday to Tuesday practice, should they take a lot out of that?
To me, it's got to be tempered because, again, it's the body of work, not just the individual day. And you have to build and you have to earn the right to step foot on that field. And you also have to build that chemistry within your unit, which complements the 3 units, which complements the team. So it's an ever-growing process. And the other thing that happens is you have veterans that you're going to give rest to. So you're going to fill younger players into that position so they can rest, veteran day off or however it is. And back in the days of the 3-a-days and full contact 2-hour practices, you had to do that more than today's practices. But you see different philosophies from every team throughout the league during training camp right now. Like, I don't know if that's how you looked at it from the front office viewpoint, but,
Training camp's a very competitive environment. And when Chuck was mentioning before, we spend so much time with these players in the off season, and they're in shorts and t-shirts. You can't do any hitting, obviously. It's not live. And you do a lot of install. You throw a lot of stuff at them from a learning standpoint. And then when you actually get the pads on, you get a chance to start seeing how some of these guys will respond, and given the opportunity, will they make plays in practice, which will then in turn, when you think about it, we're always meeting in training camp, looking at the roster, figuring out like, hey, how we stack out, who's doing well, who's arrows up, who's arrows down, who's healthy, who's not healthy. Like Chuck said, giving the veterans time to rest. That's another thing you have to work in. But in reality, it's sort of a process where you sort of funnel the better players into positions that you want to see how they perform, so it's interesting. One of the big things I always thought was when we went through this process, it's getting the chance to earn playing time in the preseason. So in the old days, we have the 4 preseason games. The first game was pretty much the starters in for it at all, in for a quick look. And then that next group that rolled in generally were the next level players in the second and third spots that you liked. And, leading up to that, that's what all the off-season stuff, when you hear about all the stuff about, hey, who's showing up or who's doing well or who's having a good day, bad day, all these kind of things. That's what it adds to, you in this process of trying to figure out who that final roster is going to be. And as Chuck alluded to, trying to figure out, hey, what's our contingency plan? Do we have depth or not? We're going to figure, and we need to figure that out now, because then if we don't, then we need to go out there and address that before we get to the final roster cut, or at least into the season. So there's so many things that go on, and it's such an evaluation process. But again, it's the players, like I said, you're trying to put them in positions to see how they'll do, and they have to earn it. Like Chuck said, like guys, they don't get a pass. They have to literally earn that opportunity to get sort of elevated. And I've been in meetings where coaches are, hey, this guy's on the rise, and let's work him in more and see how he does. And sometimes those guys go up, and sometimes those guys go down. One other thing I would say, that if Chuck remembered this, is in the off season, we a lot of players come in, especially the rookies before the vets all get in. Some guys like rise. Some guys just stand out. Okay, these guys look better than. And it's interesting. It's an interesting arc of how the players go from the spring to the fall into training camp. And you'll have a bunch of players that are doing really well in an upward trajectory. And as time goes by, they sort of whittle off. Like some guys can't sustain it once the veterans show up, or maybe the complexity of the game kind of hinders them. So they start sort of dropping off. And it's sort of a trial by fire. The guys who continue to go up are the ones that eventually become players that are going to get the time in the preseason. And then when they get on tape, it's how they do against other teams and in those environments. So.
How obvious is it, do you think? And I know that, Mike, you said that you monitored kind of what the media was saying. How obvious is it when somebody's having a good day or a bad day? Do you feel like? Or when there are reports that so-and-so had a great day, is that typically pretty close to true? Or is it sometimes like, you saw one thing, like I mentioned, the one highlight play, and you chalked that up to a good day, but really like in pass pro, it was a disaster or something like that?
The highlight plays that people see on TV, I mean, again, there's always nice ones. They're nice things to watch, whatever. We don't really follow that stuff. I think when you go into this, it's it's sort of the consistency when they're out there and what they do. Again, it's the guys are having a good day, but they sort of quietly, steadily when they have the opportunity, because really the whole practice, a whole bunch of stuff going on in practice. You get these little windows where, hey, the player come up and make a play or drop the ball or miss the tackle or whatever the case may be. But those are things you notice. And what the nuance of that sometimes is when if you really want to get analytical with it, you kind of know the beat writers that cover the team closely. And there's guys that will, sometimes younger guys, sometimes old veteran guys will really notice because it's their livelihood. They'll notice which guys do well. They'll have people in the building will say, hey, so-and-so, keep an eye on him. He's doing really good. And that stuff will trickle out. So you almost sort of scout. We used to say the old term called scout the scouts. You can almost scout the media people, because there are some people who really cover those beats really well. And again, they're pretty close. And when they start projecting the final roster, cut downs and whatever, I mean, they have pride in what they do. But some of the stuff's pretty surprisingly accurate. There's a story I used to tell people when Kenny Moore came out from Valdosta State, and he was a college free agent, and we tried to sign him. And he went to New England, and all through the spring, every day it was like something in the media, because we used to have interns used to scan all this stuff, watch these articles and look for names. And Kenny Moore's name kept up all the time in the OTAs and the offseason before the pads got on. And then in the preseason, he did some good things. In the preseason, and New England was a very good team, and they were very deep, and they eventually cut him loose, and he eventually was in Indianapolis, and it's turned out to be a really good nickel corner. But those kind of things from a media standpoint, we were aware of not only Kenny Moore coming out of college, but the fact that they talked him up like every practice. Kenny Moore made a play. Kenny Moore made a play. Kenny Moore made a play. In the New England media, and we used to joke around saying when they got the training camp, they all got kind of quiet, and we always wondered if Bill was like, "Hey, we like this guy. We want to put him on our practice roster. Don't tell anybody about him."
Exactly right.
What you saw before, Lindsay, where you're like, "Hey, you start thinking too much," but no, those are the things. And I again, if you ever went back and sort of watched Kenny Moore's media articles, like all through the OTAs and rookie mini camps, that he just kind of showed up all spring. And so again, you put him on your radar as like, hey, he may be a bubble guy, maybe a cut guy. He's definitely a guy one of our scouts look at and stuff like that.
Each team is unique, but in every team that I've worked for, there is that fine line when you get into training camp and preseason games, that there is going to be a few players on that team that there's going to be reservation to get them a lot of reps in the preseason games, because you don't want to expose them if you want to try to get them to your practice squad. And that's been a game for as long as I've been in the league, but I've lived that with every team, some being more forward about that than others. But and the other thing that Mike hit on, and I think is really important, we've talked about the off season, the organized team activities, and it's changed because of, being smart and protection for the players as far as health. But when I first went to Oakland in '98, I coached the secondary, as I told you, and we had a player, won't name his name, but he made 1,000 plays in OTAs. Okay. And I thought I had the best cornerback in the NFL. And we get into training camp, and for the first 5 days or whatever, 5 practices, same thing. I mean, he is making interceptions, pass breakups. I mean, just locking people down. As soon as we put the pads on, it's not that it changed. He disappeared. And it was so talented, so instinctive. He was a smart player. He coaches now in the NFL. And it's amazing. But when they put the pads on, it was night and day. And so he didn't make the club, but he was smart. He was this, he was that. But you can't get too excited until, you really get into live action and you get to see him really get to play. And then you have to be able to adjust on your feet, because you guys know every game is like a training camp, because from the first quarter to the fourth quarter, you may have 5 injuries, you may have no injuries. You've got to have that contingency plan, and you've got to be able to think on your feet and react. And to me, that's more important coaching and personnel than the X's and the O's, is to make sure that you have an answer if something happens.
It's funny. Both of you guys have said something that I think is worth pointing out, and that's that these guys that are making headlines and playing well enough to garner attention, you wanted to protect them, to put them on the practice squad, which kind of brings us back to the entire point here. And that is that, guys, I feel like this is the time of year people are generating headlines because we're interested in what is new. We want to know, hey, that draft pick, is he good? How does he fit in? Is he a game changer? Does he suck? I don't know. The new guy that you signed, that you brought in from, like, what we already have answers to isn't generating headlines right now. That's the stuff that come week 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, that's the stuff that's generally going to matter. Most of these guys that we're trying to discern who they are and how they fit in, only a few of them are actually going to be impact players right out of the gate, right? So maybe there's something just in that we're looking for shiny objects right now. And I think it's interesting that you're talking about some of the shiny objects. You're even thinking like, ooh, they're good enough to put on the practice squad. We don't want somebody to take them. Like, we're looking for different things.
No, that's very true. I think but I think the thing with the media, they're out there trying to, again, have stories every day and sort of fill space, because it's this 24/7 instantaneous. And I remember, it'd be funny, be watching practice and they're all literally lined up in a certain area because they can't go all over the place. They're here kind of in a box or on the sidelines. And Lindsay, you probably know this. And it's funny when something happens, like, hey, if the quarterback throws an interception, all of a sudden all their heads go down and they all start like going boom, boom, boom on their phones. It's like, good Lord, like, there must be something better to do than just chart that all day.
And I think that's a really important point to make, because, you bring up the highlight tapes and all that, and that's exactly what goes out. And you could have a player play in a practice 65 to 70 snaps, and you put out 3 snaps that he had during the day, you can make him look like a Hall of Famer. And, as a coaching staff, I learned this back with Bobby Ross in college at Georgia Tech, but Mr. Davis was so big on this, and we called them profile tapes, not highlight tapes. And we made a phrase that we termed the tape the Clint Eastwood tape, because it was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so whenever we did a prospect tape, whether it was our own player or evaluating a draft player, we had the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we were showing the entire picture. And if you didn't do that, I mean, you were held accountable. So, it's important to understand that today, like you said, Mike, with instantaneous, these, even the players sending out their own highlight tapes, you have to be cautious about that, because you can get lulled into thinking, oh, wow, this is what he's like every play. And it's not really the case. And there's a lot of times you're looking to build the strength of the team, not an individual play or position or player. You're looking at the overall strength of the team. So you may want, in certain aspects, the more consistent player than that flashy player who, 10% of the time is going to make the huge play, but 90% isn't. So, and I think with today's 24/7 instantaneous gratification of seeing things, you got to be careful.
So I think it's interesting that y'all are talking about this like instantaneous measure, because the thing that gets picked up the most obviously is injuries. And that's the thing that people really latch on to, particularly when we're talking about rookies or up and coming players or, certified starters on a team that are going to make a big difference. So I want to ask Mike first, when you're having to go and manage the media and manage injuries where you may not know if a soft tissue injury is that big of a deal until 2 days later, or you may know it was an ACL tear that then and there, but want to get a second opinion. How do you manage the 24/7 news cycle, given that injuries are frequent in training camp, but they're also, of varying levels of severity?
So the injury part is interesting because usually what happens, and even as a general manager, you find out fairly quickly, but in a lot of cases, they don't know the severity of it. So say the guy, injures his knee, they cart him off the field. Well, he's got to go get an MRI or another scan. The doctor's got to look at him. The doctor will do a physical examination to, feel the stability. If you ever seen physicals for NFL players, they basically poke and prod and test every part of your body. But a lot of that stuff you don't know right away. And in some cases, if you think it's severe or whatever, you may sort of soften the blow by explaining or leaking it or putting it out in the media pool that may be a serious injury. The reality of it is you really don't want to do anything until you have all the facts. You don't want to go preempt something because, again, you're dealing with a player, his personal health. There's sort of you protect the player as best you can. But in some cases, you don't know the severity of the injury until you get them looked at the doctor. And so when the practice is going on, the player goes off the field, you may walk in to check in if it's one of your frontline starters, or you would definitely be on the phone. Or if you actually ever are at one of these practices, if that happens, at some point in time after the player goes into the locker room, you'll notice a trainer will probably come back out and go right to the head coach or go right to the GM to explain, hey, this is what we got going on, even though they're dealing with practice and maybe that the GM is quite as much as head coach. But that's how it all goes down. Once they do get injured, and then you have to deal with, okay, what are we dealing with in terms of time loss? Okay, do we need to shuffle the roster around, bring somebody else in to, because we need numbers for positions, or if it's a serious or, depending if it's serious or not serious injury, we have so much experience with the players, their personal injury history, but also a ton of information on other players we've rehabbed. So you can pretty accurately, pretty quickly determine what the course of action is going to be, how long you're going to be without that player. I mean, it's never an exact science, but it's pretty, like the teams I've been around, it's been, again, it's fairly accurate. That's what you end up doing. And again, you don't really release anything medically until you know the facts, because it doesn't behoove you to kind of, say one thing and then, oops, it's not that. And it just, you a lot of times in the job, you're trying to create less distractions for your locker room, for your organization. You don't want to create your own news and misstep, basically.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on soft tissue injuries and when those pop up, how that changes your path forward, just with the general knowledge that soft tissue injuries can tend to linger. They can tend to come back. They're harder to establish like a specific time frame for.
Well, what's interesting? There's all the different types. So like sometimes guys will have chronic hamstring issues, and we do so much stuff now with training and supplementation and preparation off the field. But in some cases, guys have a propensity to, again, especially the guy get dehydrated. Like we go through load, all the load evaluation on the amount of distance these guys and the stress that they're carrying in terms of just the workload. And the coaches are very in tune to this. I mean, Chuck can probably speak to this. Like like a good coach knows not only like what is expected of his players, but how to manage them. And to a certain degree, like, he needs to make sure his best players are on the field healthy. So when you get into like the soft tissue issues, they're sort of grayish. Like some guys, and be perfectly honest, some guys tend to heal quicker than other guys, and some guys will have chronic things. And if the worst case scenario, if you rush somebody back too quickly, like especially like hamstrings and stuff, they can completely re-aggravate them. So, I mean, I think the one thing, it's funny when all the stuff came out about the concussions, and the NFL really did a very good job of trying to take the head out of the game, like re-emphasizing that, not just with penalties, but how we teach things and going back to lower level football and training players properly. But the health of the player is preeminent. Not only just it's the right thing to do. I mean, they're your employees. You want to make sure they're healthy and taken care of. But the other part of it is, again, if you don't have your best players on the field at peak performance, it just a greater probability you may not be successful on Sunday.
We always looked at when you got injuries, we said that checkers just became chess because, you move people around by situation, but it's with all your healthy people. Once you get injured, you're in a whole new game of strategy. And so it's not just on the field, it's how you handle practice. It's how you handle their recovery time. It's how you handle practice time. And not only is everybody different in the way they heal, but everybody's different in the way they learn without taking reps. Some players are rep players. They need those reps in order to play at maximum performance. There's other guys that can watch it on film. I use the example, I forget who I was telling this to, but, Dave Gardy went from the NFL office to the Washington Commanders, and he helped to bring along the virtual learning system that they use there because it had been exposed to us at the NFL office. I was working in the officiating department at the time. We got to see it, and it's phenomenal. So there's different ways to try to, now with all this technology we're talking about, there's also ways to still use that to your advantage as well. And so it's really interesting, but you hit on such a very important topic that has to be handled the right way. And there has to be a great communication between the front office and the coaching staff on this too, because of what Mike said. You have to know whether you got to bring somebody else in, make roster adjustments in order to do so. You've got to be really smart. So it's definitely a very important organizational decision on how you handle these things.
Yeah, it's funny. One other thing to add to what Chuck had mentioned, we did so many studies. You get a lot of information, a lot of studies come your way, stuff you do internally, stuff you do from outside companies and sources. And, it's funny, Chuck mentioned this too, that the recovery part, like the sleep part, is so critical for athletes. And again, you want to kind of make sure you're loading them with all this stuff they got to, the amount of stuff they have to learn and under duress in a very intense environment, highly competitive. And then after all this other stuff, you got to make sure, hey, we always trust them. Like, okay, this is what we explain the value of sleep in this process. You have to get proper sleep. And we have like sleep tests. We do, sleep apnea. We do all these things to try to help them do that, because I think the thing, maybe the fans don't always realize when you get inside these buildings, the amount of, the size of these organizations, the amount of resources we have, and on all the sports probably do it, but you're trying to do the best for, not just for your coaches, your scouts, your personnel people, and your players. There's so many things that come into play here. And, but that's the one thing too, is when Chuck was saying that, I was like, I just remembered off the top of my head, it was like, you do the whole, the sleep aspect of it is critical too for the players to perform at a high level and their bodies to recover and heal. People don't realize.
Fair to say that the approach to that kind of thing has changed dramatically over the years, like in terms of prioritization.
You know what? I'll start this one, Chuck, because I wanted to say this before when you were talking, and so we're kind of similar probably in age. So when I first entered the NFL, it was 1990, and Chuck had mentioned the 3-a-days and the whatever. The amount of practices we would do, and compared to what we do now, it's significantly. I find it's much different. It's a different league than it was in 1990. We just know more. It's just a different league. But one of the things I was going to say, and we're talking about like, hey, trying to identify who's doing well in training camp, and Chuck, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But I remember early on in the early 90s and 1990, like the amount of one-on-ones we would do. Like we would have long period. We'd have like a 30-minute offensive, defensive pass rush, and like now it's like 1-2 reps, boom, they're gone. And it's like you move on to something else, or they don't finish, or nobody goes to the ground. Like I remember like scrimmages where guys would go to the ground all the time. Like guys would tackle them to the ground. Chuck probably knows this. Like
how about Oklahoma drill?
go.
Oklahoma
You
drill. This
start
is that practice.
every practice was like, that was a state.
It's like barbaric when you think about it now. You're like, oh God, that was kind of a thing, but you know. But no, that was a part of the league. It was, when you're talking about, hey, who's doing well in training camp? Well, the old days, you just watched all the one-on-ones they would do. It'd be like pretty easy tell, who would show up and who wouldn't show up,
The other thing that's changed is, even back, I came in 92. And when we would go, in Cleveland with Bill, we would go up to the Bears training camp and we would scrimmage against them prior to our preseason game. I'm going to tell you the scrimmages we had and the live inside drills, one-on-ones, team, they were more competitive than the game. I mean, they were flat out live practices. And like you were saying, there were 2, 3 of them. Now, I think we have changed for the best, but it has changed the way the preparation is. So when we talked about the different ways different clubs do it, I've worked with Sean McVay for 2 years prior to him becoming the head coach. I told Sean back in 2008, I think it was, he'd be the youngest head coach in the NFL and he'd be the youngest one to win a Super Bowl. Knock on wood, got that right. But the things that he does that are outside the box, I hear the phrase from him and Les, I forget what it is, but the best player at a position is the healthy player, the one that's available. And so they are very cautious in the preseason, but their tempo of practice, they've learned how to practice without contact. And we did the same thing way back in 98, 2000 in Oakland, where you were able to practice in the off season. We would have the spotters come in from the league and they would be blown away at how fast we could practice yet not break the rules. And I think that that's what they do during practice. So they get to the games. Their guys don't play in the preseason games. And now they're shorter and they're not as competitive as what they used to be. But the preparation is done in practice. And yet other teams, Andy will play his guys, and they'll play in the preseason and get some exposure. And they have physical training camp practices. So it's just a different culture at each team, each organization. It's based on the leadership of the front office as well as the coaching staff.
Well, and I was going to say, and maybe even the players too, because to a degree, right, it depends on how your team is built and what questions you have and what you need to see and what you don't need to see, right? Like, some people have philosophies where they want to approach the preseason games this way. They could change it on a year-to-year basis, don't you think? If all of a sudden the makeup of the team was different, do you think?
The maturity of the team. Would you agree, Mike? I mean, it's based on how the locker room is, the cohesiveness and if you got a brand new team, you're going to push them a little bit harder. If you got a veteran team, you're going to be a little bit smarter that way.
One of the things, and Chuck touched on this too, which is really interesting, is when you think about it, there's so much stuff. The complexity of what we do in the NFL, and my background is on coaching. I've seen the playbooks. I've been around the installs. I've watched all the stuff they do. The complexity of what they do from a scheme standpoint. And then the other part of it is, part of it's the players and their aptitude to effectively not only perform physically, but also do the assignment from a mental standpoint. But the other part of it is like the way this thing orchestrates, the timing, the subtle little tiny things that become so impactful about execution. I would used to tell people all the time when they watch a team play and they're like, oh, you should go sign this guy. And, he ran for a 65-yard touchdown. And I was like, well, I know the guy's a 4.6 guy. I said, the reason he's running for a 60-yard touchdown is maybe the team, and I'm not going to name teams, but they've been going at that corner safety duo the whole game, trying to get him the bite on something. And then they give him a nuance in the third quarter. And then unnamed receiver goes running 65 yards down the field wide open. I say, when somebody gets that wide open, it may be ability, unless somebody got hurt. It's more likely the impact of the coaching and the matchups and all the complexity of things you do. And I could be all the time, like when you have, 11 players versus 11 players, well, it's obviously ability, scheme, all that stuff. It's the execution. And when people make mistakes and things break down in a crucial situation, and you can't sustain a drive or score points on a drive, or all these kind of things, they all add up. And this is where, again, I'd love to have I'm gonna have a conversation with Chuck offline, because this stuff is the stuff when you're not working on a team, you miss a lot of it because you haven't been around.
Yep.
But it's that nuance of it's a very simple game, but a very complicated game. And it's like, it all kind of comes together, and, people, there's different ways to do it. But the amazing part is when this whole, how you sort of teach, how you get your team to execute efficiently, and how you keep your players healthy, and if the scheme fits the players, and players, players have different developmental arcs and stuff like that. And as Chuck said a second ago, different teams are different ways. You go into a team that's a rebuild, and you got a rookie quarterback, or you got a veteran stopgap quarterback that, hold the spot for the rookie. It's going to be different than a team like, Andy in Kansas City, which is, okay, this thing's kind of like pretty well established with our key core people. And we're going to kind of go in here and make sure we're, hit the ground running on week one, and keep on rolling. But that's the beauty of the game. That's the beauty of the business, really, when you come right down to it.
So great. Chuck mentioned Sean McVay. And he was tied to, I think, the biggest example that I give in terms of signal and like trying to filter through the noise for me was Puka Nacua in the last few years, and trying to nail down like why I thought that he was going to be an immediate contributor. Largely had to do, one of the things that I'm looking for is when coaches or GMs or other players are volunteering someone's name. Like, it's not the answer to a question, because you're always going to get asked about like, hey, Drake May, how's Kyle Williams looking out there? And then he answers and you're like, well, I mean, he was asked about him. What's he going to say? Like, terrible. Like, what? Like, of course he's going to say something nice. But when people are volunteering information, it's not the answer to a question. This guy, ABC, good, and when they can specifically identify things so it feels genuine. Those are some of the things that I'm looking for, I think, after a number of years in the media and trying to figure out like what matters and what doesn't matter. That's part of the signal I'm looking for. There's also obviously the depth chart and trying to figure out, like, Puka was clearly running with the ones quite a lot in training camp. And Jordan Rodriguez, one of the best beat writers in the NFL, was reporting like his name just kept coming up and it wouldn't go away. So I think that there's maybe some signal in there in some of those ways as to whether or not that person is going to be an immediate contributor that needs to be on our radar for fantasy, for betting, for whatever reason, or whether or not somebody is just like spiking every once in a while and they're like practice squad, to your earlier point. What are the signal points that you are looking for? And you mentioned, Mike, that you're looking for even, guys on other teams, right? Because you strategically tried to hide somebody to protect them for practice squad. So, people are looking. What is the signal that you think actually matters?
So when we went through this process of trying to identify stuff, usually it's, again, the media stuff just is that's the initial phase, because you can't see their mini camps. You can't see the stuff they do in the OTAs before you get to the season. But you can sort of track and see if there's sort of commonality of, hey, names keep popping up, like you said, with Puka, and keeps going through. And then what we would do, like I used to tell people, we used to chart. Now so much stuff you can do very quickly, because this is all digitized now with the film. But in the old days, we would go through and be like, okay, tell me when this guy gets in the game. Tell me who's and we'd have interns look at every preseason game and chart, like almost like the depth chart. Okay, like here are the ones are all in, and then who's the third receiver, who's the fourth receiver that comes in, and which names pop up in what order. And the same thing, like I said, so the ones would go in, then sometimes they would, like, before the ones left, they would put the right tackle, with the second string right tackle would come in for whatever reason, injury, and we would make note of it. If so-and-so appeared to have an injury, boom, in the media, this guy comes in. So we knew that was the sixth lineman or the next tackle. So much of that stuff we used to do sort of longhand. And it wouldn't necessarily give you a huge tell, but it would really give you, if you really followed it, and the simple logic was, they're going to play their best players because, in essence, they want to figure out who they're going to play on Sunday in 3 weeks from now and 4 weeks from now when the preseason is going on. So that's what we used to do. So if their name pops up when you can't see the practices, that'd be one thing. When you get to the preseason, it's like, hey, who actually plays and when? And then you can start figuring out, okay, who's their bubble guys, who's not going to be on the roster, who's suddenly being featured a lot. And quite frankly, with what we do now, you can go back and really, like, almost reverse engineer the playbooks with all the data and all the ability to map everything out for an NFL team, and you can see play tendencies and you can see who shows up. I do think generally players earn their way onto the roster by making plays in the preseason. Like, again, you can do it in practice, but it really counts when you got there. And if it's a small window, I mean, it's a big body of work, but ideally, like when you're given you earn the right to play in the preseason with the ones or the twos or the threes when you go in. And then when you're in there, you can like, hey, the first week you're running with the threes. Next week you make a bunch of plays in the first week. You elevate into the, and then you're running with the twos the following week. And then you can make note of that. So that's sort of, again, Lindsay, back to your original question. The media tracks it to a certain degree and they'll pop up stuff that pops up. But then when you start going into the actual film and who plays, because very seldom you're going to see somebody who doesn't play at all in the preseason start on, unless it's a veteran not playing with injuries like that. Again, who plays in the preseason tends to play on the, make the final roster. And if they don't, then you can evaluate them to see if they're worthy enough to add to your team.
The other thing that's a benefit is, and I'm sure it's just like this even today with things being a little bit different, because the joint practices, like I said, we would go up to Chicago for Plattsville, Wisconsin for a week, 8 days prior to the game. And we would go against that. And then we'd leave and we'd go to Arizona and go against Buddy Ryan's Cardinals. And what you got to do there was firsthand. We spent more time at night grading the Chicago team than we did grading our own players at the end of practice. And that was just the way Bill worked, because come the end of training camp, when cuts were made and these moves, the checkers became chess again, you wanted to have as much information. So we would have to write these guys up, and we would literally go in and offensively and defensively, and the special teams coordinator would do the special teams. We'd go in and we would grade their offensive players or defensive players, and we would have grades on all of them as well. So, again, now it's no different. You still have joint practices. They're just not as long. They seem to be 1 and 2 days now, or 1 or 2 practices prior to the game. So you're not getting as much exposure.
And then no one plays in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
The joints are the game.
Yeah. Hey, one other thing. It's funny, Chuck. When you were saying that, I honestly I haven't thought of the cheese league. They used to call it the cheese league in the preseason. Yeah, back in the day. Yeah. And that in itself, when you thought about the number of teams, like New Orleans used to go up there. I mean, teams from all over the country would go up there. And when you guys had those inter squad scrimmages, like again, there were probably more fights than whatever, not fights, but there's probably a lot more
sometimes fights
there. And in some cases, like you sort of see your guys versus your own guys, and I don't want to say you get necessarily a false read on what you have, but when you see him versus somebody else's player they haven't seen for the first time, and hey, going against him one-on-one in matchups, they don't know if he's this is a strong guy, this is an athletic guy, like whatever, and you watch your own players how they show up. I mean, that's also, as Chuck said, a very good tool. It's funny, when I was at the Jets and I think they're going to actually scrimmage the Giants or have inter-squad scrimmages. But when I was there, that was all everybody said, no, we can't do it with the Giants. Too much bad blood. It just turns into a bunch of, fights or, whatever, little incidents. And practice gets, and then Chuck knows this too. Like if you get too chippy in practice, you can't get your work done. And then you're like, hey, let's stop, everybody separate and we'll go our own ways. And even though you could get a lot of good work done, it's just the nature of those competitive athletes. In those environments, especially in-town rivals, it's like, okay, just gotta watch out.
There's a line, right? Because you do want it to get a little chippy. You want that to come out in the practice, but then just don't tip over the line.
It's a violent game. It's a physical game, but in the end, it's you're still trying to get work done, because that's the big thing you want to get out of preseason.
Classic story with Buddy Ryan's group. We went out there.
Buddy,
I think it was 94. We went out to Arizona. And we go to our first practice, and we're both stretching on separate fields. And all of a sudden, there's a commotion over on the Arizona field. There's an all-out brawl amongst themselves. And he set their team. We practiced by ourselves that day. We had been out there. He set them all in. It was a classic. It was classic.
It's an amazing,
that feels on brand.
Amazing lead.
So good. You guys, this has been really, really helpful and so interesting for Sam and I. So thank you so much for making time. I know you guys are already starting to ramp up with all the scouting stuff and are super busy. So thank you so much for offering your insights to us. And we look forward to having you guys back on the show if you're open to that at some point during this season. Thank you so much, Mike and Chuck.
Appreciate you and the opportunity, man. There's nothing like talking football. So
Yeah.
Thank
This was great. Bring back a lot of memories too. So it's kind of nice.